Life is nothing but a collection of moments, and when it changes, it often changes in just a moment. For hundreds of people and their families, that moment occurred at 9:02 a.m. in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, when an explosion nearly destroyed a federal building, killing over 150 people and injuring hundreds. But the trauma and grief that would follow the bombing is impossible to tally, and the attack lives on as the worst instance of domestic terrorism in United States history. After an extensive investigation and a few big breaks, officials eventually arrested and charged the men responsible. One would be and the other would receive life in prison. There wasn't any question of their culpability, and though the nation reeled from the attack, they felt assured that justice had fully been served. And for most people, that's where the story of the Oklahoma City bombing ends. But should that really be the end of the tale? Well, if you decide to take a closer look at the case of the Oklahoma City bombing, you may find that the story isn't quite as cut and dry as you may have thought. In fact, there's some incredibly compelling evidence that the official account of the bombing doesn't hold water, and that some people who were involved in this heinous crime were never held accountable and still walk amongst you today. So, what do the Philippines, the mysterious death of a police officer, and the Branch Davidians cult all have to do with the tragedy in Oklahoma City? And what implications do they have for the authenticity of what the public has believed for nearly 30 years? Join us today as we dive deep into the dark story of the Oklahoma City bombing in this episode of The Conspiracy Files. As a conspiracy researcher and host of The Conspiracy Files, I frequently find myself diving into deep dives and complex mysteries that require sustained energy and mental focus. And so, given Magic Mind's request to endorse their product family, particularly the Energy Shot, I conducted an in-depth investigation into the company and its offerings. And trust me, this dive went deep. Magic Mind is a company that was founded in 2018 by James Bashara, a tech entrepreneur turned biohacker, and the company's based in Los Angeles, California. The company itself focuses on mental performance enhancement, offering products like the Mental Performance Shot, the Sleep Performance Shot, and Mental Performance Gummies. Magic Mind's product line centers on mental performance, with the flagship being the Mental Performance Shot, often referred to as the Energy Shot. This 2-ounce shot contains 12 active ingredients, designed to enhance focus, energy, and motivation, while at the same time managing stress. The ingredients inside that Mental Performance Shot include matcha green tea, ashwagandha, lion's mane mushrooms, and vitamins C and D, and it's designed to boost focus, energy, and motivation while reducing stress. And with only 55 milligrams of caffeine in each shot, it also enables people to take the shot without that energy boost and crash that comes with coffee. Research suggests that the Energy Shot is effective for productivity, with many users reporting increased focus and sustained energy, as seen in reviews on websites like Amazon. For instance, one user noted, "It helps me with sustained energy and has 55 milligrams of caffeine. Perfect for me." And if you're like me and you have tons of things to juggle on a regular basis, I would 100% recommend you add Magic Mind's Mental Performance Shot to your regular daily routine. Also, Magic Mind is offering a sweet 50% discount, which you can cash in on by visiting the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on screen. They're also so confident in what they've built that you have 100 days to ask for a full refund if you don't like it. 0 questions asked, even if you drank the shots. There's literally no risk to trying their product. So if you want to try Magic Mind, you want that 50% off discount, use the link in the description, scan the QR code on screen, and I can confidently say after researching this company for a few hours, I couldn't find anything but positive reviews, praise, and scientific studies that backed up what they're claiming. Anyways, y'all, let's get back to our show. So before we go any further, I want to do my normal announcements. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Everything that I'm stating in this show is simply my opinion, COLIN BROWEN. I'm the only one who has these opinions, and I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to do anything to myself, so I'm safe, and I don't plan on having anything happen to me in the near future in case something ever were to. So the Oklahoma City bombing. I have family in Oklahoma City. I've always felt connected to this story in some sort of a way. I mean, first of all, the entire story is just absolutely heartbreaking and tragic and infuriating. But, you know, after researching the story a little bit further, I realized that not only were there some inconsistencies here, but there's some pretty compelling evidence to show that there were more individuals involved in this plot that literally got away. Now, Everybody is going to have their own opinions about this sort of a thing. Obviously, I think that the tragedy is, simply put, a tragedy. And I'm not questioning anything about victims or what they're saying. And my heart goes out to all families that were affected by this horrific event. But I don't know. The stuff that we're going to talk about today is pretty disturbing, and it might just change the way that you view this whole thing, kind of like the research process for this episode has for me. But let's just get into it. First, we're going to cover the official story. At the start of the workday on April 19th, 1995, hundreds of people were going about their daily business in the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The building was 9 stories tall and hosted offices for a myriad of federal agencies, including the DEA, Social Security Administration, and the Army and Marine Corps. It also housed a daycare, where employees could leave their children as they headed to their jobs. Just before 9 a.m. on that day, security cameras at the nearby Regency Towers apartments captured footage of a Ryder rental truck driving in the direction of the federal building, where it then parked on the complex's north side. At 9:02 a.m., that Ryder truck, which had been loaded with 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, nitromethane, and diesel fuel mixture, exploded. At 9:03 a.m., emergency services received the first of what would be over 1,800 911 calls related to the explosion. The truck's detonation was catastrophic. The northern portion of the building where the truck had been parked collapsed in just 7 seconds. The blast registered as a 3.2 on the Richter scale, and it shattered most of the windows downtown in Oklahoma City, leaving the streets covered in glass, debris, and fluttering papers from the destroyed building. The impact of that explosion was felt up to 55 miles away, and the ensuing damage to the downtown area would be estimated at over $652 million. But the human cost would be far worse. The bomb planted inside the truck would lead to the deaths of 168 people and a further 680 injuries. 19 of those were babies and children who had been in the building's daycare center. And just a minute after the bombing, as the first of the 911 calls began to come in, first responders were already rushing to the scene. As the injured were taken away for treatment, those on site began urgent attempts to locate more victims trapped beneath the rubble. A photographer captured the devastating image of firefighter Chris Fields carrying infant Bailey Allman away from the site. The photograph captured in an instant the horror and unspeakable tragedy of the bombing, and endures as one of the most famous images captured that day. Heartbreakingly, little Bailey would later pass away at the hospital. As rescue efforts continued and officials ensured that there were no more explosives in the area, investigators were already beginning their intense work tracking down the perpetrator responsible for the most deadly instance of domestic terrorism in United States history. The FBI's extensive investigation would go on to include 28,000 interviews, 3,200 kilograms of evidence, and nearly 1 billion pieces of information. But even before all the work that would be done in the weeks and months following the bombing, investigators got a break in the case almost immediately. Less than 90 minutes after the explosion, Oklahoma Highway Patrolman Charlie Hanger spotted a car speeding down the highway without a license plate. Hanger pulled the vehicle over and ordered the driver out of the car. The man that stepped out of the vehicle was slim and quiet, with a military-style haircut. Hanger could see that he was armed. The two had a tense exchange, and Hanger ordered him to turn around and put his hands on the car. The driver obeyed, but the tension didn't cease. Hanger can recall the moments in minute detail, and he makes a statement to me that I think he's trying to intimidate me. He said, "Well, my weapon is loaded, and I've still got a death grip on the outside of the jacket where his weapon's at." And I nudged him to the back of the head with the barrel of my pistol, and I said, "Well, so is mine." On the ride from the point of arrest to the jail, we could still hear Oklahoma City headquarters and my unit dispatching units downtown. He made no comments. That's a quote. The man Hanger had arrested was Timothy McVeigh, a former soldier with radical anti-government views. The officer arrested McVeigh for driving without a license plate and carrying a concealed weapon. And as McVeigh was processed by the local police, news reports of the bombing played over the television. Hollier Marcia Morit remembers watching McVeigh as he took in the news coverage. And Timothy McVeigh is standing there with us, and he had no comment to make. And he just looked at the TV, calm, didn't say a word about what was going on. The fingerprinting stood out to me because his hands didn't sweat, and he was cool. He was just not. He was not upset, and he was seeing what we were seeing on the TV. Though the police with McVeigh didn't yet know, he was connected to the bombing, and they immediately took note of his strange demeanor. He seemed unnervingly unaffected by the devastation being recorded. Meanwhile, the FBI was already hot on the trail for leads on the bombing, and they had another crucial break while McVeigh was being arrested and booked. Officials found a truck axle in front of the Regency Tower Apartments, the same building whose cameras had captured the vehicle minutes before the explosion. It belonged to the Ryder truck that carried the bomb and had somehow survived the destruction with a vital piece of information still intact. When the rear axle assembly came flying through the air at that distance and that weight, it crashed into the top of the red Ford Festiva on the hood, and it knocked the car plumb up onto the curb, recalls John Hersley, one of the lead FBI investigators on the case. We were able to trace that. There's a partial vehicle identification number that was on the rear axle assembly. It's PVA 26077. I'll never forget that number, I don't think, as long as I'm alive. The serial number led investigators to where the Ryder truck had been rented, and from there they determined that it was indeed a 20-foot Ryder truck, 1993 Ford box truck, and that it had been leased out of Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City, Kansas on April 17, 1995, 2 days prior to the bombing, said Larry Tongate, another lead FBI case agent. Sketch artists spoke with employees from Elliott's Body Shop and drew up composites of the two men who had rented the truck. They were labeled John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2. The FBI quickly learned that Timothy McVeigh was John Doe number 1 and that he was already in jail for charges of driving without a license and carrying a concealed weapon. He'd been arrested already that very day. Investigators dug into Timothy McVeigh's character and past with zeal, and what they found was a man, though once a skilled soldier, who had become radically anti-government in the years leading up to the bombing. Already deeply disillusioned with the government, McVeigh's views seem to have been cemented by the events at Ruby Ridge in 1992 and at Waco in 1993, instances that both included violent government action. Ruby Ridge was an 11-day standoff between the FBI, the United States Marshals, and white separatist Randy Weaver at his isolated Idaho cabin. Also on the property at the time was Weaver's family, including his teenage son Sammy, his wife Vicky, and her infant child. Weaver, who had connections to the Aryan Nation and other white supremacist groups, was being pursued for warrants related to weapons charges and failing to appear for trial. Knowing Weaver would likely become violent when cornered, the FBI and Marshals attempted a stealth operation, but their efforts went sideways, and in the ensuing violence, Weaver's dog, as well as his teenage son who had exchanged fire with officials, would be shot. Events turned even fouler when a shot not intended for Vicky struck her in the face while she stood holding her infant child. Though the baby lived, Vicky died, and her body remained in the cabin for 11 days. The case would garner national attention, and both the FBI and Marshals would face heavy criticism for their missteps, which led to potentially unnecessary violence. The shot that killed Vicky would later be ruled unconstitutional. The other event that had greatly disturbed Timothy McVeigh was the Siege of Waco, a violent confrontation between federal agents and the Branch Davidians cult on their compound in Waco, Texas. That was another raid that didn't go according to plan, and that ensuing standoff would last a staggering 51 days and involve multiple instances of prolonged gunfire and the use of tear gas. The first volley of gunfire lasted for over 2 hours and 4 agents, as well as 6 Branch Davidians. Nearly 900 law enforcement officials then descended upon the area. On April 19th, the FBI deposited over 400 tear gas canisters inside the compound, which earned return fire from the cult members. The Davidians then began setting fires, and due to safety concerns, firefighters were not permitted to assist for 15 minutes. But by then, it was too late. When the fires were finally extinguished, officials found the bodies of 75 people inside, 25 of whom were among the dead were the cult's infamous leader, David Koresh. In total, the Siege of Waco, 4 government agents, and 82 Branch Davidian members. And just like Ruby Ridge, Waco drew intense public criticism for its violence and potential mishandling. It's been contended that the tear gas could have played a role in the start of the fire that caused most of the deaths. Timothy McVeigh wasn't the only American who was displeased with how officials handled Ruby Ridge in Waco, but he took his dissent a step further. Believing that the government had become tyrannical, he began to plan the bombing of a federal building. And in Timothy McVeigh's view, if the federal agents who had been present at Waco and Ruby Ridge wanted to act like soldiers, he would too. McVeigh hoped that such an attack would spur a rebellion that would usurp the corrupt government. Instead, it led to the deaths of nearly 200 people and traumatized the nation. McVeigh viewed the casualties as a necessary part of his mission. "I didn't define the rules of engagement in this conflict," he said. "The rules, if not written down, are defined by the aggressor. It was brutal, no holds barred. Women and kids were at Waco and Ruby Ridge. You put back in the government's faces exactly what they're giving out." He also stated, "I wanted the government to hurt like the people of Waco and Ruby Ridge had." McVeigh wasn't the only man involved in the Oklahoma City bombing, though. Forensic evidence quickly connected another survivalist, a man named Terry Nichols, to the bombing. Nichols and McVeigh had met in 1988 at Fort Benning during basic training for the U.S. Army, and following their service, both became radically anti-government. Together, and with further accomplice Michael Fortier, McVeigh's former Army roommate, the men purchased the materials necessary to build the bomb. But neither Terry Nichols nor Michael Fortier were the men who had gone with Timothy McVeigh to Elliott's body shop to rent the Ryder truck that would house their detonator. And in fact, to this very day, John Doe number 2, who was seen renting the truck that the bombing would be carried out with, has never been conclusively identified. But we do know that it wasn't Terry Nichols or Michael Fortier. What is known for sure, though, is that on the morning of April 19th, Timothy McVeigh drove to downtown Oklahoma City, where he then parked the truck and fled before its explosion. Timothy McVeigh had chosen that day in particular for the attack. It was the anniversary of the violent end of the Waco siege. During the bombing, McVeigh wore a t-shirt that read Sic Semper Tyrannis, which translates to "Thus always to tyrants." This was the same phrase allegedly shouted by Brutus as he assassinated Julius Caesar, and John Wilkes Booth as he shot Abraham Lincoln in the head. That shirt would later test positive for bomb residue. But none of the men involved in the bombing were exactly master criminals. So before 24 hours had passed, the FBI already had Timothy McVeigh in custody and were in the process of connecting Terry Nichols to the attack too. They had pretty high IQs, but they weren't everyday criminals. They weren't dealers, they weren't bank robbers, they weren't kidnappers, they weren't car thieves, so they didn't have a background in conducting crimes, Agent Hursley said. But despite Timothy McVeigh being the man who planted the truck, the FBI still believes that Terry Nichols was the primary instigator of the attack. Let there be no mistake that Terry Nichols was the brains behind this. He was the person that plotted it. He was the person that egged McVeigh on to do it. He just didn't want to be caught, Hursley alleges. But despite Terry Nichols potentially being the leader of that small group of domestic terrorists, it was Timothy McVeigh himself who would get the needle following his conviction in 1997. He was in June of 2001, and Terry Nichols was sentenced to life in prison in 2004. So essentially, that's the official story. Terry Nichols, Michael Fortier, and Timothy McVeigh had all met up. They had all come together in their own ways, and they eventually decided that, hey, I want to bomb a building. I want to strike back at the government. They worked for months to plan this whole thing. They collected all the materials. They went through some trials and testings and eventually built the bomb. And then they executed the plan, and Timothy McVeigh was the one who drove down to the city that day and escaped alone. No one else has ever been connected to this whole thing. That's just the story. And now we have to get to the conspiracy. So, as far as the public goes, the Oklahoma City bombing was a vicious and tragic attack that was quickly solved by the swift work of federal agents. Today, most people believe that all involved were arrested, and that the man who planted the truck, Timothy McVeigh, was appropriately punished for his acts of terrorism. But for those who have taken a keen interest in the bombing and its explicit details, the story that the public knows may not be all there is to it. And while it's true that any event like the Oklahoma City bombing is sure to attract conspiracy theorists, no matter how airtight the official story is, there actually is some pretty compelling evidence that all the facts about that awful day in 1995 either aren't known or aren't fully accurate. As a result, there are some lingering questions about the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building that have yet to sufficiently be answered. Namely, some of the questions are, were Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols really the only major players in the planning and attack, or are there other perpetrators who have escaped justice and potentially still pose a threat to the United States? And is it possible that those unnamed participants were members of a foreign nation, making the bombing of Oklahoma City more than a cut and dry instance of a few radical domestic terrorists? These are questions that haven't just been asked by fringe theorists. They've even been posed by congressional committees and the defense lawyers who represented Timothy McVeigh long after his conviction, and their duty to argue his innocence evaporated. People who have concerns about the veracity of the official story of the Oklahoma City bombing aren't just grasping at straws. There's some real meat here. They're taking hard looks at crucial pieces of evidence and the holes in officials' explanations that are sure to raise the eyebrows of anyone who's open to the potential of there being more to the story. One of the first questionable pieces of evidence is something that's already been briefly introduced: the mysterious John Doe number 2, one of the men who rented the truck from the body shop that would be used in the bombing days later. While officials were able to positively conclude that Timothy McVeigh was John Doe number 1, the man who was with him has never been found, and it's clear that it was neither Nichols nor fellow conspirator Michael Fortier. So who is John Doe number 2? And if he's never been identified, isn't that a huge red flag indicating that those who were tried weren't the only ones involved? Well, the FBI's explanation for John Doe number 2 isn't entirely convincing. They allege that the employees from the body shop who gave their descriptions of the men who rented the truck to FBI sketch artist Roy Rotchke confused their days. While they gave accurate descriptions, it wasn't McVeigh and a second man they were remembering. It was, according to the FBI, Michael Hertig and Todd Bunting, 2 U.S. Army soldiers who rented a Ryder truck the day after Timothy McVeigh did. According to the FBI, the soldiers matched Timothy McVeigh well enough to explain why thousands claimed he was one of the men after the sketches were released to the public. The mix-up could mean that Timothy McVeigh really did rent the truck alone, and that there actually is no John Doe number 2 on the loose. For his part, the body shop owner insists that Timothy McVeigh himself was accompanied by another man. And according to a report following an investigation by an investigation subcommittee, the truck shop owner also alleges that the FBI has pressured him to change his story multiple times over the years. Interestingly, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee that looked into the bombing reported coming up against an uncooperative FBI. It reported, quote, "Federal law enforcement has been accused of an institutional mindset that congressional oversight is a nuisance to be avoided or blocked. That mindset was painfully obvious during this subcommittee's inquiry into the Oklahoma City bombing. Instead, Justice Department officials, and perhaps the CIA, were less than responsive in crucial stages of this investigation, exemplifying needless defensiveness. Most of the official narrative of the Oklahoma City bombing investigation survives close scrutiny. However, this inquiry would have been significantly more complete with greater cooperation from federal law enforcement." End quote. The subcommittee's reporting underscores not only the possible elusiveness within the FBI, but the need for further investigation into the OKCB storyline. And when it comes to the question as to whether Timothy McVeigh was accompanied by another man, there are others who report similar sightings, and not just at the body shop where the truck was rented. While he was in Kansas renting the Ryder truck, Timothy McVeigh stayed at a place called the Dreamland Motel, where a Chinese food driver delivered food on April 15th. But while the food was delivered to Timothy McVeigh's room, the driver is positive that it wasn't Timothy McVeigh who opened the door and accepted his food delivery. He says that it was for sure, without a doubt, John Doe number 2, based on taking a look at the sketch. But he's not the only one who saw another man with Timothy McVeigh. There was also an employee from a tire shop in Oklahoma City who claims that on the day of the bombing, he saw Timothy McVeigh and a, quote, dark passenger, end quote, wearing a ball cap pull into the driveway of his store. According to this employee, the pair pulled up at 8:45 a.m., roughly 20 minutes before the attack, and asked for directions. The same witness was able to pick Timothy McVeigh out of a lineup without having seen the FBI sketches. Now, Timothy McVeigh denied having ever stopped at a tire shop to his lawyers, but the witness's claims are still interesting, particularly when paired with other accounts on the day that may indicate that not only did Timothy McVeigh not rent the truck alone, but he also didn't execute the bombing alone either. Such a revelation would go against what has always been the accepted story, which is that the attack was planned with Terry Nichols, and to a lesser extent Michael Fortier, and that Timothy McVeigh planted and detonated the bomb completely alone. But John Doe number 2's existence throws a wrench in that story. And if there was another man with Timothy McVeigh that day, who was he? And how deeply were they involved with the plan from its start? In the years since the bombing, there have been several men who have come up on the list of potential participants. Perhaps the most infamous suspected additional culprit is a man named Andreas Strassmeyer, a German from a well-known far-right family. For years, Strassmeyer has appeared in various conspiracy theories, and he gained attention from officials rather quickly, and their interest grew when they learned that Andreas Strassmeyer had a personal and pretty close relationship with Timothy McVeigh. Strassmeyer met Timothy McVeigh at a gun show in Tulsa in 1993. While they were there, they bonded over their shared radical views on the government and their displeasure of its handling of Ruby Ridge. Like Timothy McVeigh, Andreas Strassmeyer was a soldier himself. He served for 5 years in the German army before he eventually made his way to America, where he served as head of security forces at Elohim City, a white separatist community in Oklahoma. Elohim City is a pretty crazy story if you just read about that itself. It's a completely separated community, isolated really from the outside world, strictly of white people. Very, very radical, very, very white separatist, white supremacist, and lots of connections to domestic terrorist events. But it's unclear to this day how close Timothy McVeigh and Andreas Strassmeyer were. While the two contend that they weren't good friends, some witnesses have asserted that they definitely were. You see, Timothy McVeigh was known to mention his friend Andy the German to others, and it's been reported that he had even been invited by Andreas Strassmeyer to visit Elohim City, though he never seemed to have taken him up on the offer, at least according to official reports. But certainly, there's plenty of evidence to show that Strassmeyer and McVeigh knew each other beyond simply chatting for a few minutes at a gun show. And according to the subcommittee investigating, quote, on April 5th, 1995 at 3:48 p.m., Timothy McVeigh called Elohim City, ostensibly searching for a place to hide out after the bombing. Reverend Miller's daughter-in-law answered the phone, and McVeigh asked to speak with Strassmeyer, who was unavailable, end quote. So there you go. You actually have in the government subcommittee findings in their investigative report saying that at 3:48 p.m., 2 weeks or so before the bombing, Timothy McVeigh himself called Elohim City, that white separatist community, and asked to speak with Strassmeyer himself. Why would he do that so shortly before the bombing? And especially if he wasn't close with anybody that lived there or Strassmeyer himself. But here's something else incredibly suspicious. You see, shortly after the bombing, Andreas Strassmeyer fled the United States. He escaped and returned to Germany, though it hasn't been confirmed exactly who helped him get there or who gave him notice. Notes from a 1997 FBI investigation, however, show that it was allegedly CIA pilot Dave Holloway that flew Andreas Strassmeyer back to Germany. But other documents state that he was aided by members of Germany's elite counterterrorism unit, GSG-9. It remains unclear which is true, but they've both been referenced in official documents. Despite the fact that Andreas Strassmeyer was under surveillance for his potential involvement in the bombing early on, the FBI wouldn't go to interview him until 1996, after he had already fled the United States. And that interview was brief and took place over the phone, hardly an effort that was likely to gain any good insight into the Germans' potential role. Now, there's nothing necessarily concrete that ties Strassmeyer to the Oklahoma City bombing, other than his position as a far-right radical, his friendship with Timothy McVeigh, and alignment with his motives, but he remains a name that comes up frequently when theorists discuss potential other participants. It should be noted, though, that at one point an undercover agent actually was assigned to infiltrate Elohim City, where Andreas Strassmeyer and all those other white separatists were living. And this undercover agent, this confidential informant working for the ATF, actually told her superiors that Andreas Strassmeyer would frequently talk about, quote, blowing up federal buildings, end quote, and using, quote, direct action against the US government, end quote. So that's a pretty bizarre coincidence, right? This guy is good friends with Timothy McVeigh. He's telling undercover informants about how he'd love to bomb federal buildings. He gets a direct phone call from Timothy McVeigh before the bombing, and he escapes the United States right afterwards, supposedly with help from a CIA pilot. But he's not connected to this in any way, according to the official story. But Timothy McVeigh isn't the only bombing conspirator suspected to have had help from outside influences. Terry Nichols, the other man convicted for these crimes, had his own dubious relationships as well. You see, Terry Nichols began his first of several trips to the Philippines in August of 1990. Trips that he alleges were mainly to locate a wife, which he eventually did do. Terry Nichols married a woman named Marif Torres in November of 1990. But that wasn't the only thing he got up to while in the Philippines. According to witness Daisy Gillespie, Terry Nichols asked her, quote, if she knew anyone in the military or anyone else who could help him make a bomb, end quote. And on his final trip to the Philippines, Terry Nichols also brought with him the book, The Chemistry of Powder and Explosives. That final trip took place just months before the bombing in Oklahoma City. Well, both of these pieces of evidence make it questionable as to whether Terry Nichols was really there to find a wife or was looking for help making a bomb. There's still more evidence that's concerning. Before he left for the Philippines on his final trip in 1994, Terry Nichols left his wife a sealed note and emphasized that she shouldn't open it unless he didn't return. She obviously ignored his instructions and opened the letter. Inside, she found details on where Terry Nichols had stashed away $20,000 for her and their son. Terry Nichols' explanation for where the money had come from was weak at best. He claimed he had earned that money babysitting. A better explanation might be that it came from a robbery that he ordered on a gun dealer named Roger Moore, but that robbery's never been confirmed to have been connected to Terry Nichols. And Terry Nichols himself never gave investigators any clarity, and as a result, some people have proposed that the money was related to the upcoming bombing. Was Terry Nichols being paid to plan the bombing and then push McVeigh to complete it? And if so, by who? Who would have been paying Terry Nichols? Well, some suggest that the Midwest bank robbers, a group of white supremacist criminals who robbed at least 18 banks in the 1990s, may have had something to do with it. So 2 of the men in that extremely alt-right group had at one time been roommates with none other than Timothy McVeigh's German friend, Andreas Strassmeyer. It's an eye-catching coincidence, and the plot continues to thicken. The Congressional Subcommittee reports that another gang member named Richard Guthrie claimed to them that he had information on the bombing and was going to talk to them. Richard Guthrie had come to the FBI or whatever agency he had reported to, and he said, "I know some secrets about the Oklahoma City bombing. I have some truth that I need to get off my chest. I need to tell you guys because it's eating me alive." But Richard Guthrie, the day after he told authorities that he was going to tell them the truth related to the bombing, he was found dead in his jail cell. How bizarre is that? One guy's going to tell the authorities he's involved in this gang and he's a member of these groups, and he says, "I know some pretty damaging stuff about what really happened here," and then he's found dead the very next day. While the report couldn't officially confirm the Midwest bank robbers' involvement, it lists the possibility of them funding the bombing as one of their major unanswered questions. But aside from getting married and sourcing strange amounts of cash, Terry Nichols was up to some other strange things too. You see, while Terry Nichols was in the Philippines, it's been reported many times that he improved his bomb-making skills. In Michael Fortier's testimony, he claimed that Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh's first attempts at making explosives failed terribly. But according to the subcommittee, following his time in the Philippines, Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh, quote, were fully capable of manufacturing the crude but deadly bomb that was used to bring down the Murrah Federal Building, end quote. And if Terry Nichols was indeed learning from someone about bomb making, we may know who it was. You see, Terry Nichols' wife, Murrah, had a friend named Vilma Lumbering, who had allegedly dated a man with the last name of Khan. The 3 reportedly partied together at a disco just 1 month before Terry Nichols arrived in the country for the first time. That seems like a trivial detail. A friend of Terry Nichols' wife, who knows what that's connected to or why we're bringing that up. Well, it seems like a trivial detail, but it becomes critical if the rumors that Khan was actually Wally Khan, who trained terrorists in the Philippines, are correct. So this Wally Khan was rumored to be an expert at making explosives, and he was even convicted of plotting to blow up United States planes. So how strange is that? A very good friend of Terry Nichols' wife dated a man named Khan. There was a Khan in the Philippines who was an expert at making explosives and was a terrorist. If the man Murrah knew was really Wally Khan, that would mean that Terry Nichols' wife was in contact with a dangerous terrorist. That doesn't prove anything, and it's kind of conjecture, but it raises critical questions about Khan's potential influence and whether or not he assisted in the of 168 Americans without ever facing any repercussions. And interestingly, when investigators reached out to Khan in prison to ask him about his involvement in the Oklahoma City bombing, he declined to be interviewed. He said he didn't want to talk. Lingering questions about additional unnamed culprits, though, aren't the only things that stick out to people who question the narrative. And this time, the evidence comes from closer to home. Terry Yeakey was a police officer in Oklahoma City, and he saw the destruction and tragedy of the bombing up close. On the day of the attack, Terry Yeakey himself rescued 3 people from the rubble of the federal building, pulling at least one from under debris where he had been trapped. But less than a year later, just days before he was set to receive an award for his heroic actions, an award that he didn't want, Terry Yeakey was dead. The official ruling was that Terry Yeakey had unalived himself. On the surface, the story is tragic but incredibly believable. You see, Terry Yeakey had witnessed some of the most traumatic events imaginable, and like many of his fellow first responders, he had been forever changed by what he encountered when he arrived on the scene that awful morning in April. And while heartbreaking, self-unaliving doesn't really seem out of the realm of possibility for someone who was haunted by his experiences with a domestic terror attack. But taking a look at Terry Yeakey's death, for even just a little bit, you start to notice that the story goes from tragic to disturbing quite quickly. For starters, Yeakey didn't want that Medal of Valor at all, despite the fact he had clearly earned it through his acts of terrorism. Because in the days and weeks after the bombing, the police officer had become convinced that the public wasn't being told the whole truth about the attack. He was sure that federal officials were working overtime to hide something, to cover up the true story of the bombing. You see, on the day of the bombing, Terry Yeakey injured his back while pulling victim Randy Ledger from the destruction. When his wife Tanya picked him up from the hospital after his treatment, Terry Yeakey was in tears. He told his wife, quote, "Tanya, it's not what they're saying it is. They're not telling the truth. They're lying about what's going on down there." End quote. It's not clear what Yeakey saw that made him suspicious, but some contend that it relates to theories that the government had prior knowledge of the attack and did nothing to stop it. In his 2023 article on Officer Yeakey and the events surrounding his death, CNN journalist Thomas Lake writes, quote, "In the months and years that followed, a stubborn contingent of skeptics pursued other angles to the story. They insisted that government officials were somehow culpable. It was a botched sting operation, they said, or perhaps the government permitted or even orchestrated the bombing for political advantage. The government denied these allegations, of course, and still does. Still, there's something about the case that makes people want to keep investigating. There were multiple reports of prior warnings given to some federal employees, of an unidentified second suspect in the Ryder truck, and of additional explosives that allegedly contributed to the blast. Lake reports that Yeakey believed that some government employees were lying about where they were during the bombing. He was also suspicious about the details of the explosion. According to his sister, LaShawn Hargrove, Terry Yeakey saw signs that the bomb had come from inside of the building, not outside in the truck. Now, admittedly, Yeakey wasn't an explosives expert, and likely he was deeply emotionally affected by his experiences on the day of the attack. But whatever it was that he saw that gave him pause, it troubled him enough that he couldn't let go of it. A few days after the bombing, Yeakey decided that he needed to go back down to the site. There was something he wanted to see. So he and his wife Tonya drove to the federal building. Tonya recalls, quote, "We did go down there, probably between 9:30, 10 o'clock, and he said that we were going to go look underneath where the daycare had been. There was something he wanted to see over there and get a picture, if possible." End quote. But the pair wasn't able to gain re-entry. According to Tanya, after trying to use his badge to gain access, Yeakey had a, quote, "very antagonistic," end quote, interaction with an agent who told him that he wasn't supposed to be back. Seeming to not want to push his luck with Tanya in the car with him, Yeakey then left, but he didn't give up doing his own digging. Eventually, he pieced together a detailed report on the attack, a report he told Tanya had disappeared after he'd submitted it to his supervisors. And according to Yeakey, that report that he wrote himself and submitted also earned him the ire of the entire department. And Yeakey isn't the only police officer who's claimed that their dissenting accounts on the story of the bombing were scrubbed from existence. Keep that in mind too. Yeakey himself compiled a report on things he had seen, people he had talked to, things that he noticed didn't make sense about the official story, and he submitted that report and it vanished. It's never been seen again. And then obviously shortly afterwards he was found dead. Former Oklahoma City police officer Steve Vassar also to this day claims that his own reporting on the events mysteriously went missing too. Steve Vassar had been downtown the day of the bombing and had seen the Ryder truck with his own eyes. And though the official story has always been that Timothy McVeigh was alone in the truck, Steve Vassar is sure that that isn't the case. Quote, "I'm going to tell you right now, as God is my witness, there were two people," end quote. That was a direct quote from Steve himself. That CNN reporter Lake also wrote, quote, "Vassar says that although he wrote this account in one of his supplemental reports on the bombing, no investigator ever questioned him about what he'd seen. Years later, he searched for his reports in the Oklahoma City Police Department's computer system. He says he saw hundreds of other reports about the bombing and its aftermath, but he couldn't find his own reports. They were gone. He said, "They were not in the system, as if I never was there." Despite facing pushback from officials and his work going missing though, Terry Yeakey never backed down from his efforts to uncover the truth about what really happened that day. And as he continued talking to people, checking evidence for himself, visiting locations, and investigating, Yeakey became more and more convinced that something was very, very wrong with the Oklahoma City bombing storyline. He He also told loved ones that he was becoming fearful for his life. Yeakey began showing up at Tanya's house at strange hours. He seemed deeply afraid. She recalls, "He wanted me to leave in the middle of the night with him. He said, 'We need to get remarried. Don't ask me questions. This is the only way I can make sure you and the girls are taken care of in the event that something happens to me.'" End quote. Then, in May of 1996, a little more than a year after the bombing, Yeakey brought a VCR and a videotape to Tanya's house and left it in her car. He also talked to her about some insurance papers. That was the very last time that she ever saw him alive. Yeakey also visited his sister Vicky and her husband before he died. Though Vicky and her husband have both since passed away, his other sister, LaShawn, has details on the visit. According to LaShawn, Yeakey was exhausted and crying. He told them that the official story about the bombing was wrong, but he couldn't give them any more details. Seems that he was afraid to even share what he had discovered. "It's just not what they say it is," he was quoted as saying at the time. Yeakey also met with Ramona McDonald, a businesswoman who had been downtown during the bombing. The two met in the hours after the attack. Ramona McDonald claims to this day that Yeakey told her he had been asked to meet with men from a task force who wanted to see the evidence he had collected about the bombing, but he wasn't sure whether he should do as they asked or not. Though he thought it could be a dangerous situation, Yeakey didn't want to walk away from an opportunity to speak with people who might have taken his evidence seriously. Maybe these men could help him uncover the truth. Maybe they could even help him inform the public. In the end, Ramona McDonald said, Yeakey decided to go to that meeting, unarmed. He didn't want them to be able to use his own weapon against him. He left Ramona McDonald's house to go meet the men where they had requested, somewhere near a federal prison in El Reno, Texas. And later that very day, Ramona McDonald learned that Terry Yeakey was dead. Oh, that gives me chills, actually. That is so crazy. Oh my God, that's crazy. Yeakey was found roughly 2 miles away from that prison. Lake described the site as, quote, a lonely windswept place with tall grass under a big sky, end quote. It was a place that, according to his sister LaShawn, Yeakey was afraid of. Quote, I remember him at one point in time saying that lots of bad things went on over there. He wouldn't have been caught. Oh, excuse me. I was getting ready to say that he wouldn't have been caught dead there, but I guess he was, end quote. Yeakey's death was ruled a self-unaliving almost immediately, despite extremely strange details existing about the scene and his body never being autopsied. His injuries were incredibly odd. His neck and wrists had been and he had been shot in the head. And according to Tanya, sources within law enforcement told her that Yeakey had bruises and rope burns on his ankles and wrists, evidence that he had been bound before his death. There was also dirt and grass in his wounds, as if he had been forced to the ground. When LaShawn heard about the condition of Yeakey's body, she told their mother, quote, Mama, they him, end quote. The scene of Yeakey's death didn't seem to make sense either. Though there was a large amount of blood in his car, his body was found half a mile away from his vehicle. Lake sums up the incongruities by saying, quote, if the prevailing narrative is correct, Yeakey arms and neck with blades heavily in his car and then walked or ran about half a mile into either a field or a grove of trees where he to death. Following her ex-husband's death, Tanya was absolutely positive that someone had broken into her home and burglarized it. The VCR and tape that Yeakey had left her were gone. She hadn't been able to view the tape yet and didn't know what was on it. Taking all together, Yeakey's comments about the truth being hidden, his paranoia, the strange circumstances of his death, the meeting with individuals from a task force, and the evidence disappearing from Tanya's house, all that's disturbing. I mean, you can't make this shit up. This guy claims he's basically found the truth behind everything. He's talked to all these people. He's investigated it. He's incredibly paranoid, worried that he's going to die sometime soon. He kind of makes some final preparations. He leaves a VHS tape. He goes to a meeting that he's claiming is with people from the government, and then he's found dead that very day after going to the meeting. Then someone breaks into the person's house where he left the evidence and steals all of it, and it vanishes. Not even to mention, his police reports being gone and his investigative notes that he turned into the police department also being gone. So what had Terry Yeakey discovered? Had his theories been correct? Was he murdered to prevent the truth from being known? Many who knew him are sure that he never would have unalived himself, even after the trauma of being at the bomb site. Quote, I think they murdered Terry because he knew too much, LaShawn said. Steve Vassar had been a very good friend of Terry Yeakey. Quote, "I still don't believe Terry did it," he said. "I have just a hard time believing that Terry would..." And Dan Browning, a veteran Oklahoma City police officer of over 30 years, said, quote, "I still think he was murdered," end quote. And Ledger, a man that Terry Yeakey carried from the rubble, doesn't buy the self-unaliving story either. Ledger is the man that Terry Yeakey actually saved on the day of the bombing. He carried him from the rubble. And when quoted about Yeakey's death, he said, quote, "There's too many unanswered questions," end quote. But in the end, dissenting voices, demands for an autopsy, and pleading from family members haven't changed anything. Officials maintain that Yeakey self-deleted. The same day he was buried, Terry Yeakey posthumously received the Medal of Valor he'd been due to receive. Terry Yeakey's story is either the tragic story of an officer driven to self-unaliving or the gruesome murder of a man who knew too much. I think it's the latter. And looking at all the details, it's difficult to not see it like that. The only thing that's undisputed here is that Terry Yeakey was a hero. After saving lives on the day of the bombing, he pursued what he thought was the truth, despite thinking he was in grave danger. Whether his suspicions were warranted or not, he did what he thought was right until the very end. In the final article on the officer, Lake sums Yeakey up with moving simplicity. He writes, quote, "A picture taken that morning shows the officer in action. He has sweat on his brow, blood on his shirt, dust on his shoes. Terry Yeakey is running toward the danger," end quote. If you look at something hard enough, even a small detail can be massaged into the truth you want to believe. And the world is certainly full of strange coincidences that, while looking odd, ultimately don't amount to anything more than strange coincidences. So it's no surprise that when you dig into the story of the Oklahoma City bombing, you find some things that stick out. A conspirator running in the same circles as terrorists in the Philippines, carrying with him on his trips there books on making bombs. Multiple witnesses who swear that Timothy McVeigh wasn't alone on the day of the bombing, even though the government to this day sticks with their story that he was. A mysterious John Doe that was seen with Timothy McVeigh who was never found. A police officer desperate for the truth who claimed he had discovered the disturbing reality who turned up dead under highly suspicious circumstances. And let's not forget the ring of suspected co-conspirators. The guy who was talking to people in prison saying, "I want to tell you the truth about the bombing," who was found dead the very next day. Andreas Strassmeyer, who received a phone call from Timothy McVeigh right before the bombing, who had talked to undercover agents about wanting to bomb federal buildings, who escaped the country allegedly with the help of a CIA pilot. I mean, there's definitely something rotten here. Something happened here. It's hard to tell exactly what it was, but there is something more than just the official story. But which of those details are real pieces of evidence and which are just circumstance and coincidence? Which have been blown out of proportion? And even if one is true, what does that mean for the entire story of the Oklahoma City bombing? Well, there are always people who want to find some hidden agenda or uncover a secret plot. So we should definitely expect conspiracy theories about that tragic day in 1995 to abound. But you, the viewer, after looking at all this evidence, what are you willing to ignore? And what are you willing to take at face value? Because when taken all together, it's difficult not to open your mind to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, what we know about the terror attack that killed 168 people, including 19 children, isn't all there is. So, I could talk for days about the Oklahoma City bombing. These were just some of the things that have really stuck out to me the most when considering the story. And yeah, I definitely think that there were people that got away that were involved. And once again, I really don't know what to make out of all of this. It's pretty bizarre stuff because on one hand, it seems like there were some more far-right extremist people that were involved in this that were allowed to escape or were never investigated. But then you wonder, why were they not investigated? What was the government's reason for not pursuing real justice here? Was this something that they were made aware was going to happen beforehand and then they just ignored those red flags and let it happen for some sort of a political reason? Was this something that government officials or even deeply enmeshed intelligence agents actually helped facilitate? Or was this really just all coincidence and I'm just talking out of my ass? I don't think that that's true. I think you know that that's not true. That's what it boils down to me at the end here is if all of this is really connected to the Oklahoma City bombing, which I think it is, what's the reasoning? Because there's no good reasoning. So many theories, there's a good reason as to why things were covered up. There's some motive, there's some skin in the game, and yet In this case, it's a bit unclear. It's like the darkness is right there and it's trying to speak to us through all these clues and pieces of evidence, but I just can't tell what it's saying. Anyways, y'all, thank you so much for listening and watching today's episode of The Conspiracy Files. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure to like the video, comment on the video, and subscribe to the channel. It helps so much. It helps these videos grow. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a 5-star review. Let people know that you're enjoying the show, because it's only through you people that we can grow this thing, because these platforms definitely don't want to promote shows like this. So yeah, it's grassroots, and it really helps to have all of you guys out there helping us as much as you do. I want to thank Amelia GP for writing this script and for doing some research here. Amelia, wonderful job. And yeah, y'all, you always got to keep an open mind. This is I hope that I changed your mind a little bit and opened your mind to these possibilities here. But for the Conspiracy Files, it's Colin Browen here. As always, guys, keep that tinfoil hat on. Always question everything. And stay suspicious. I'll see y'all next week.